Do you know when the first suicide attack in Afghanistan took place? It wasn't by the Taliban, nor ISIS. In fact, there was a time when the word suicide attack didn't even exist in the Afghan vocabulary. But as the war dragged on, something changed. Fear turned into anger, anger turned into revenge. And revenge took the shape of something horrifying, a man becoming the weapon himself. Today, we uncover that dark transformation, the true story of the early suicide attacks in Afghanistan. When the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, everything changed overnight. The Taliban regime fell, a new government was promised, and the West spoke of freedom, peace, and democracy. But beneath the banners of liberation, there were wounds that never healed. Wounds of loss, humiliation, and hopelessness. And from those wounds rose a new kind of terror, the suicide bomber. At first, no one could believe it. An Afghan taking his own life to kill others. It was unthinkable. But soon, the explosions began. Kabul, Kandahar, Jalalabad, no place was safe. The first major suicide bombing hit an American convoy outside Kabul. A young man drove his car into a U.S. military vehicle and detonated it. The blast shook the capital and the minds of everyone watching. That day, the war in Afghanistan entered a new, terrifying phase. Western soldiers saw it as a new tactic, but for many Afghans, it was a cry from the ruins. The young man who pressed that trigger wasn't just killing. He was shouting to the world, "You destroyed our homes. Now we will destroy your peace." From 2002 to 2006, suicide attacks became more organized, more frequent, and more ruthless. At first, they targeted military bases and convoys. Then, it spread markets, schools, hospitals, even funerals. Fear became a language that everyone spoke. Parents told their children not to walk near foreign vehicles. Shopkeepers stopped opening their stalls near checkpoints. Every loud noise made hearts race. Inside the villages, a dangerous narrative was spreading, that dying as a martyr brought honor, that taking one's life in the name of faith meant salvation. For many young men who had lost everything, that promise became irresistible. Recruiters knew this well. They didn't need to convince. They only needed to remind them of what they had lost. The story of these early suicide attacks isn't about monsters. It's about broken people living in a broken war. One boy's father was killed in a U.S. airstrike. Another saw his village wiped off the map. A third grew up hearing only the sound of drones. For them, revenge wasn't evil, it was justice. One American officer once said, "We can kill 100 fighters a day, but we can't kill the idea that fuels them." And that idea, the belief that dying would bring power, was now deeply rooted. The bombers became symbols. Each explosion carried a message. You can't occupy our land forever. As the years went by, these attacks changed the course of the war. Every explosion eroded trust. Locals feared foreigners. Foreigners feared locals. A handshake could be a trap. A smile could hide a bomb. Kabul became a city of suspicion. In 2005, when a bomber detonated himself outside a school, killing both children and soldiers, something snapped in the Afghan people. Mothers screamed not for their sons, but for the country itself, torn between two enemies, the occupiers outside, and the darkness growing within. Journalists began calling Afghanistan the land of endless funerals. Each morning began with smoke. Each night ended with prayers for survival. The Americans built more walls, installed more checkpoints, flew more drones, but the bombers always found a way. Behind every explosion, there was a recruiter, a promise, a prayer. Some bombers were foreigners, trained and paid. Others were locals who left behind notes for their families. "I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm doing this for our land." By 2007, suicide bombings had become a regular weapon. Children learned to recognize the sound before the explosion, the revving of an engine, the panic in soldiers' eyes. The word Shaheed became part of daily conversation. Death was no longer strange, it was expected. But here's what most people don't know. Not all bombers were willing. There are stories of young men drugged, strapped with explosives, told that they were carrying supplies. Some never knew, until the last second, what they were part of. Others were manipulated by false promises that their families would be cared for, that paradise awaited them. Imagine a country where faith is weaponized, where poverty becomes ammunition, and where hope dies before the body does. That was Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Western media showed the explosions, but never the pain behind them. They showed the wreckage, but not the faces. Not the mother who found only her son's ring. Not the child who walked home alone because his father never came back. One Afghan elder once said, "In our land, we bury the dead with dust, but the memories, they never die." And that is the truth of these early suicide attacks. They were not just acts of war. They were the screams of a generation that had nothing left to lose. And yet, even in that darkness, there were stories of light. Villagers who stopped recruiters, imams who preached against violence, families who refused to send their sons to die. They believed Afghanistan could be rebuilt, not by bombs, but by hope. But hope was hard to find when the sky itself roared with planes. The more the occupation continued, the more the attacks spread. It became a cycle, a war feeding itself. The Americans called it counterterrorism. The Afghans called it survival. By 2010, suicide attacks were no longer shocking. They had become part of life. The sound of an explosion meant a new tragedy, another scar, another grave. Afghanistan had become a nation living between two silences, the silence before the blast and the silence after. When people today talk about Afghanistan, they often speak of politics, of strategy, of power, but they forget the human side. The father who dug graves for his sons, the mother who prayed that her last child wouldn't follow the same path, the soldier who couldn't tell enemy from friend. The early suicide attacks in Afghanistan weren't just the start of a new weapon. They were the start of a new kind of war. A war not fought for land, but for belief. A war where both sides claimed righteousness, and both sides lost their humanity. The world may have moved on, but the echoes of those first blasts still haunt Afghanistan. The same streets, the same fear, the same unanswered question, was it worth it? And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not just the deaths, but the loss of meaning behind them. Because every explosion, every body, every tear, they weren't just statistics. They were stories, real stories. If you've made it this far, you now know the truth, the real story behind the early suicide attacks in Afghanistan. And if you want to hear more stories like this, the untold side of history, the side no one dares to show, then subscribe to the channel, because here, we tell the real story, the one you won't find in books. If you liked learning this part of Afghanistan's history, make sure to subscribe, because here, we reveal the truth the world tried to forget.